Amira woke up before the sun had even risen, the soft orange light barely touching the city streets. Her small apartment smelled faintly of bread and coffee, the remains of last night's late dinner. Despite the modest surroundings, she carried herself with quiet determination, tying her apron and smoothing out her uniform as if it were a suit made for a queen. Every morning, she reminded herself that today could be different, that even the smallest efforts could change something, somewhere, for someone, maybe even for her. She walked to the cafe where she worked, her worn shoes tapping softly against the cobblestones. It wasn't a fancy place, just a local cafe tucked between towering buildings, where people often hurried in and out, too busy to notice the world around them. But for Amira, this cafe was more than a job. It was a stage where she performed her daily acts of kindness, patience, and hard work, even when the world seemed indifferent. As soon as she arrived, Amira began her routine, sweeping the floors, arranging chairs, and checking that the tables were spotless. Her hands moved with practiced grace, each gesture precise but gentle, as though she were painting invisible strokes of care on the restaurant itself. Even though the pay was meager, she took pride in her work, believing that the smallest attention to detail could leave a lasting impression. But working at the cafe wasn't easy. Many of the customers were impatient, demanding, and sometimes outright rude. Some would snicker at her uniform or the way she carried trays, making comments that stung more than they should. There were days when she went home with tears in her eyes, longing for a world where people looked beyond appearances. Yet, Amira had learned to carry these moments with her quietly, never allowing bitterness to take root in her heart. She understood that life was not about proving people wrong. It was about proving to herself that she could rise above pettiness and still maintain her dignity. Despite the challenges, Amira found small joys in her work. She loved seeing children smile when she served them their favorite desserts, even adding little extra touches, a sprig of mint, a drizzle of chocolate, that no one else noticed but made a difference. She enjoyed listening to the stories of regular patrons, nodding politely as they shared bits of their lives, even when their words sometimes carried subtle judgments or assumptions about her. These small interactions reminded her that kindness and attentiveness were gifts she could give freely, regardless of how they were received. Her co-workers, however, did not always share her perspective. Many envied her quiet resilience or dismissed it entirely. They would sometimes make jokes at her expense, whispering when she walked by or laughing behind her back. Amira knew she could retaliate, join in the gossip, or defend herself loudly, but she chose a different path. She had learned early that the world rarely changes because of anger. It changes because of patience, intelligence, and self-respect. So she smiled, nodded, and focused on her work, letting her actions speak louder than their words ever could. On particularly busy days, when the cafe was crowded with tourists and local elites, Amira often felt the sharp contrast between her life and the people she served. She watched men and women in expensive suits and jewelry, laughing and speaking with confidence, completely unaware of the struggles of the girl carrying their drinks. It would have been easy to feel small, invisible, or resentful, but Amira had a quiet fire inside her. She reminded herself that appearances could be deceiving and that intelligence, courage, and kindness were not measured by wealth or status. Her mind often wandered to the dreams she had tucked away, like delicate paper boats floating on a distant river. She dreamed of one day working in a place where her talents and intelligence would be recognized, where people would listen to her ideas, and where she wouldn't have to justify her existence. Until that day came, she worked with diligence, always observing, learning, and preparing herself for opportunities that might arrive unexpectedly. She had a sense that life had a strange way of rewarding those who stayed true to themselves, even when the world seemed unfair. That morning, as she arranged the tables and polished the silverware, Amira felt a mixture of anticipation and hope. She didn't know what the day would bring. Perhaps another difficult customer, maybe a moment of kindness, or an unexpected encounter that could change everything. But she was ready. Ready to face the laughter, the doubts, and the whispers, armed only with her courage, intelligence, and heart. She paused for a moment near the entrance, taking a deep breath, and allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't a smile born of victory or triumph. It was a smile born of resilience. She had survived ridicule, judgment, and loneliness, and she would survive whatever came next. Today, like every other day, she would do her work with grace, patience, and quiet strength. Because Amira understood something that many did not. True worth is revealed not in wealth or recognition, but in character, compassion, and the courage to keep going when the world doubts you. Little did she know, that very day, something extraordinary was about to happen. Something that would challenge the assumptions of everyone around her and finally show that her quiet strength, knowledge, and heart were far more powerful than anyone had imagined. But for now, she carried on, unaware of the life-changing moment that waited just beyond the cafe doors, ready to turn her ordinary day into an unforgettable story. The cafe where Amira worked was tucked into a quiet street, but just a few blocks away, the world transformed completely. Towering glass buildings gleamed in the sunlight, and the streets buzzed with expensive cars and well-dressed people moving with a confidence that seemed almost unreal. Amid this glittering cityscape stood the Regal Grand Hotel, a place that could take anyone's breath away. Its golden doors, polished marble floors, and sparkling chandeliers made it look like a palace pulled straight out of a movie. This was the kind of place that seemed to exist in a different world, far removed from the struggles of someone like Amira. Amira had been to the hotel once before, delivering catering orders for special events. She remembered feeling a strange mix of awe and intimidation. Everything gleamed as if the very walls reflected wealth, power, and elegance. Waiters moved with precision, carrying trays without a single spill, while guests sat in velvet chairs, sipping drinks that cost more than a week's wages for people like her. The air smelled faintly of perfume and luxury, a scent that made her both dizzy and fascinated. She couldn't help but notice how different this world was from the cafe she called her workplace. That day, she had been assigned to serve at the hotel's private lounge for a high-profile event. She entered through a side door, her steps echoing lightly on the marble floor. The room was enormous, filled with crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls from the ceiling. The tables were polished to perfection, covered with white linens that gleamed in the soft golden light. Everywhere she looked, people moved gracefully, their laughter soft and melodious, their conversations full of the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money or survival. Amira adjusted her uniform, feeling slightly out of place among the guests who clearly belonged to a world far above her own. Some of the hotel staff had noticed her nervousness and smiled politely, offering brief nods of encouragement. But others seemed indifferent, caught up in their own routines, gliding past her as if she were invisible. She reminded herself to focus on her work and not let the grandeur intimidate her. After all, she had faced difficulties before, and she knew that her skill and determination mattered more than appearances. The guests arriving for the event were a mix of socialites, business magnates, and celebrities. Their laughter was often loud and teasing, and many of them didn't hesitate to judge the people around them. Amira noticed how some of them glanced at her with mild amusement, their eyes scanning her uniform and modest posture as if trying to decide whether she belonged in their world. It wasn't the first time she had felt this way, but the feeling was sharper here, in a place where wealth and power seemed almost tangible. Some of her co-workers at the hotel were less welcoming than the guests. A few of the more experienced waiters whispered jokes about Amira as she passed by, calling her the little girl from the cafe, in a tone that made her cheeks warm with embarrassment. Others looked down on her, assuming she lacked the knowledge or poise to navigate this luxurious setting. Amira could have felt defeated, but she refused. She straightened her back, reminded herself of her capabilities, and silently vowed to prove, if not to them, at least to herself, that she could handle this world with grace. As she moved through the lounge, balancing trays of sparkling champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres, she observed the people around her with careful eyes. Some guests were kind, offering polite smiles or gentle nods as she passed. Others were impatient, tapping their fingers on the table or whispering to companions when she approached. But Amira had learned the art of patience. She treated every person with the same professionalism, never showing frustration or insecurity. She knew that how she carried herself could make all the difference, even when surrounded by people who judged her by her uniform or background. The venue itself seemed alive, almost as if the walls and ceilings were aware of the stories unfolding within them. The chandeliers reflected light in patterns that danced across the marble floors, and the soft music from the live band created an air of sophistication. Waiters and waitresses moved like clockwork, their footsteps synchronized, their smiles perfectly timed. In this world of perfection, even the smallest mistake could draw attention. Yet Amira remained calm, walking steadily, delivering trays with precision, and answering questions with a polite confidence that surprised even herself. She noticed one table in particular, where a group of wealthy young socialites had gathered. They were impeccably dressed, their laughter sharp and loud, occasionally spilling over to include whispers and small, pointed jokes aimed at anyone they deemed less sophisticated. Amira could feel their eyes on her as she served drinks nearby. Some of them rolled their eyes when she approached, others smirked and exchanged glances, clearly judging her. Yet, she held her head high, answering polite inquiries with care and even finding small ways to impress without appearing boastful, like knowing which champagne paired best with which appetizer, or recommending a dessert that she knew had subtle flavors many might miss. Even as the wealth and grandeur pressed in around her, Amira felt a strange sense of excitement. She wasn't here to blend in or to compete. She was here to do her job to the best of her ability. And perhaps, she thought, in this place filled with wealth, arrogance, and judgment, there might also be someone who recognized her worth, not for her uniform or her background, but for her knowledge, her heart, and her resilience. Little did she know, that very person was about to arrive, changing her day and her life forever. The day had already begun to feel extraordinary, even though Amira hadn't realized why yet. She was moving steadily through the lavish lounge, balancing trays of sparkling drinks and delicate pastries, when a sudden hush fell over the room. Conversations slowed, laughter faltered, and even the music seemed to soften for a moment. All eyes turned toward the entrance, and Amira instinctively followed their gaze. Through the golden doors walked a man whose presence seemed to command the room without a single word. He was tall and impeccably dressed, in a suit tailored to perfection. Every movement he made was calm yet powerful, as if he had all the time in the world and yet every second mattered. The room seemed to bend around him. The soft hum of whispers rose instantly, as people tried to catch glimpses of this figure. This was Sheikh Khalid, a billionaire known not only for his wealth but also for his sharp intellect, decisive mind, and an aura of mystery that had followed him across continents. Amira had heard of him before, of course. In the city, his name was spoken with a mix of admiration and awe. People whispered stories about his business successes, his vast properties, and the exotic locations he frequented. Rumors claimed that he was both fair and formidable, generous to those who impressed him and merciless to those who underestimated him. Yet, seeing him in person was different entirely, more striking, more powerful, more alive. He seemed to carry with him a quiet confidence that drew people's attention without any effort. The guests at the event straightened in their seats as the sheikh moved through the room. Some tried to act casual, pretending not to notice him, but Amira could see the way their eyes followed him, their subtle attempts to look impressive or worthy of his attention. Whispers rippled like a current through the room. "He's arrived. Have you seen him in person? Magnificent, powerful, intimidating." The energy in the room changed, shifting from light chatter to a quiet reverence that made even the regular waitstaff pause for a second, adjusting their composure, as if they had been reminded that they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. Amira felt her heart beat faster. She was used to intimidating customers, demanding clients, and wealthy patrons who thought themselves untouchable. But Sheikh Khalid exuded a different kind of authority. It wasn't loud or boastful. It was calm, precise, and absolute. Yet, despite the power he radiated, there was a softness in his eyes, a curiosity that suggested he wasn't just observing people from a distance. He was truly seeing them. As he approached one of the tables, the air seemed to shift around him. Guests straightened their posture, trying to appear confident. Some whispered to each other, speculating about what he might do, what questions he might ask, and whether they could impress him in any way. It was clear that the Sheikh's presence alone had the ability to make people reveal who they truly were. Some nervous, some arrogant, and some polite but careful. Amira, standing at a nearby station with a tray of drinks, felt a mixture of fear and fascination. She watched as he scanned the room, his eyes briefly meeting hers. She quickly looked away, heart racing, convinced that someone like him would never notice someone like her. Yet, in that moment, something strange happened. She felt as though he had seen more than just her appearance. He had noticed her posture, her confidence despite the subtle mocking from others, and the quiet determination in the way she moved. It was a fleeting glance, but it left a mark on her. A feeling that perhaps this man could see more than anyone else had bothered to. The Sheikh's arrival caused a ripple effect among Amira's co-workers. Some of them straightened their ties or smoothed their uniforms, eager to impress. Others whispered quietly, speculating on who would be lucky enough to serve him. Amira, however, reminded herself to stay calm. She didn't need to impress anyone with flashy gestures or forced smiles. Her skill, knowledge, and composure were enough. She focused on her work, making sure each drink was perfectly balanced and each plate flawlessly arranged. As Sheikh Khalid moved closer to her section of the lounge, the chatter around her seemed to fade. Even the music seemed to bow to his presence, the soft notes blending into the background as all attention subtly shifted toward him. He paused for a moment, surveying the scene, and then spoke. Not loudly, but in a voice that carried authority and calm at the same time. The words were polite, almost casual, but the effect was electric. Every head turned. Every guest held their breath. And Amira felt a chill of anticipation run down her spine. He asked a question. One that seemed simple on the surface but had layers of complexity that only someone observant and knowledgeable could answer. The room fell silent, and Amira noticed that no one at the nearby tables moved or spoke. The arrogant guests exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. They were used to being the smartest person in any room, but suddenly, the question seemed to reveal gaps in their knowledge. The Sheikh looked thoughtful, patient, yet his eyes sparkled with curiosity. He seemed to be waiting, not just for an answer, but for someone who could impress him with insight, intelligence, and clarity. Amira felt her pulse quicken. She wasn't sure why, but something inside her told her that this was a moment unlike any she had experienced. She realized that the Sheikh's question wasn't meant to intimidate. It was an invitation, a challenge to see who among them had substance, depth, and understanding. She could see the smugness fading from the guests' faces, replaced by uncertainty and nervousness. And in that silence, a small spark of hope ignited in Amira's heart. For the first time that day, she understood that extraordinary things could happen in ordinary moments. Here was a man of immense power and wealth, and yet he wasn't just observing the surface. He was seeking authenticity, knowledge, and character. And perhaps, just perhaps, someone like her, a humble waitress who had always worked hard, paid attention to detail, and carried herself with dignity, might have a chance to rise above the assumptions of the world around her. The room was alive with laughter and chatter, the soft clinking of glasses punctuating the gentle hum of conversation. Amira moved gracefully between the tables, her tray balanced perfectly as she served drinks to the guests. She was accustomed to polite smiles, occasional compliments, and sometimes the faint air of judgment that came from wealthy patrons who looked down on those in service. Yet, nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. At one corner of the lounge, a group of young socialites had gathered. Their clothing shimmered under the chandeliers, jewelry catching the light as they leaned in close to whisper, their laughter sharp and deliberate. They had been watching Amira since she arrived, exchanging glances and subtle smirks. Finally, one of them, a tall man with an air of arrogance, spoke loudly enough for several nearby tables to hear. "Look at her," he said, smirking, "carrying those drinks like she's trying to hold up the world. Do you think she even knows what she's doing?" The group erupted into laughter, a cruel sound that ricocheted off the marble walls. Some guests glanced at them, momentarily amused, while others ignored it, focusing on their conversations. Amira felt a brief sting in her chest, but she reminded herself to stay calm. She had faced ridicule before, and she had learned that letting anger show only gave others power over her. She straightened her back, adjusted her tray, and continued to serve, her movements smooth and deliberate. The man wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, gesturing dramatically as if he were delivering a punchline to the entire lounge. Honestly, who lets someone like this near a place like this? It's almost insulting. Maybe she should stick to that tiny cafe she came from. The whispers and laughter grew louder, and for a moment, the room seemed to close in around Amira. Her cheeks warmed with embarrassment, and she felt the familiar weight of judgment pressing down on her. But this time, instead of retreating inward, she focused. She took a deep breath, letting the rhythm of the lounge and the gentle movements of her work center her. She knew that this mockery was not about her abilities. It was about others' insecurities and assumptions. Amira moved closer to the table, her tray steady, her eyes calm. "Can I offer you some more drinks?" she asked politely, her voice soft yet confident. There was no hesitation, no hint of resentment, only professionalism and grace. The man blinked, momentarily taken aback. He had expected her to flinch, to apologize, or to retreat into silence. Instead, she met his gaze without fear. Her composure only seemed to amuse him further. "I asked a question," he said, leaning forward, his tone mocking. "Do you even know what you're serving? Or are you just pretending?" Amira smiled faintly, a smile that carried no arrogance but a quiet assurance. She had studied the menu meticulously, memorized the flavors, and understood the subtle details that made each dish special. This knowledge, which had seemed ordinary to her, now felt like a secret weapon. She could answer with precision, without hesitation, showing that her skill and intelligence were more than just her humble position suggested. Nearby, her coworkers watched in surprise. Some had never seen her respond to ridicule so calmly. Others whispered quietly among themselves, some impressed, others resentful. The socialites continued to snicker, convinced that their wealth and confidence would overshadow any answer she could give. They did not realize that ridicule could never diminish someone who carried herself with dignity and knowledge. The man leaned back, shaking his head in amusement. "Well, we'll see," he said, smirking. "Maybe you can prove us wrong. Maybe there's more to you than meets the eye." His tone was dismissive, but the challenge hung in the air, almost like a test. Amira's heart beat steadily. She understood that this moment was pivotal, not just in the eyes of the mocking guests, but for herself. This was the chance to show that skill, intelligence, and grace were not determined by wealth, appearance, or status. The guests at surrounding tables were watching closely now. Some had initially ignored the exchange, but the combination of arrogance from the socialites and calm confidence from Amira had drawn attention. It was a contrast that was hard to ignore. Ridicule meeting quiet strength, assumptions challenged by knowledge. Even the hotel staff seemed to pause, watching as the situation unfolded. Amira took a small, steadying breath and continued her work, offering additional details about the dishes she served, explaining flavors and combinations with a calm authority. Her knowledge was precise, her explanations clear and concise, and her demeanor unshakable. Slowly, the laughter around the table began to fade, replaced by a sense of uncertainty. The man who had mocked her first seemed to realize that she wasn't just a humble waitress. She was someone who understood her work, who carried herself with skill and intelligence, and who refused to be diminished by arrogance. The mockery, which had begun as a source of embarrassment, started to shift into something else. It became a moment of revelation for those who had been laughing. They began to see Amira differently, as someone who commanded respect not through wealth or status, but through knowledge, composure, and inner strength. She moved among the tables, completing her service flawlessly, turning a moment of potential humiliation into a quiet demonstration of competence and dignity. For a brief moment, Amira allowed herself a small thought, that sometimes the greatest victories come not from confrontation or shouting, but from staying true to oneself. Even in the face of mockery, even when judged unfairly, there was power in grace, intelligence, and patience. And in this moment, she realized that her life could change, not because she sought recognition, but because her quiet strength and abilities were visible to those who were truly paying attention. As she stepped away from the table, the man's smirk faltered slightly. Something in her had shifted the room's energy, something that he had not expected. The lounge had returned to its usual hum of conversation, but the dynamic had subtly changed. Amira had faced mockery and emerged unshaken, turning the moment into a testament of her resilience, intelligence, and composure. And somewhere in the room, Sheikh Khalid observed it all. His gaze had been watching, assessing, waiting. He had noticed not only the mockery but also the way Amira handled it, with patience, knowledge, and courage. He made a subtle note to himself. This was a woman who would not be underestimated, a woman whose abilities and character might surprise more than just the arrogant socialites. The lounge had settled back into its usual rhythm after the brief storm of laughter and mockery. Guests sipped their drinks, servers moved gracefully between tables, and the soft music filled the space. But in one corner of the room, a quiet tension lingered. A tension Amira could feel even without seeing. Sheikh Khalid, tall, composed, and radiating calm authority, had been observing everything. He had watched the mocking socialites, the reactions of the staff, and most importantly, the way Amira had handled herself. His gaze lingered on her, steady and thoughtful, as if assessing more than her performance. It was her character, intelligence, and composure that drew his attention. He finally moved closer, his presence commanding a quiet stillness. Conversations faltered, and even the music seemed to soften as he approached her. The socialites had stopped their whispers, now watching with a mixture of curiosity and concern. No one quite knew what he would do. Some guests straightened in their seats, hoping to catch his attention, while others looked uneasy, sensing that this was a moment unlike any other in their polished, predictable world. Sheikh Khalid stopped near Amira, his eyes meeting hers. There was no arrogance, no impatience. Just a quiet expectation that seemed to ask a question even before he spoke. Amira's heart beat faster, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had prepared for this, even if she didn't know it yet. All her years of hard work, careful observation, and dedication to her craft had led to this moment. She knew that how she handled it could change the course of the evening, and perhaps something even larger. Then he spoke, his voice smooth, calm, and deliberate, carrying across the few steps between them. "Tell me, what is the rarest flavor in this menu? One that most people overlook, but that brings balance to the entire dish?" The room went silent. Guests who had been confident and smug moments before now froze, unsure how to answer. The socialites exchanged nervous glances, realizing that their assumptions about superiority did not prepare them for this question. Some murmured quietly among themselves, while others simply shrugged, embarrassed that they could not provide an answer. Even the hotel staff looked uncertain, their knowledge vast but not specialized enough for the specificity of his query. Amira felt a flicker of recognition in her mind. She had spent weeks memorizing the menu in detail, observing each ingredient, and understanding how flavors combined. This was no ordinary question, it was subtle, layered, and precise. But unlike the others, she felt ready. She didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess herself. She stepped slightly closer, took a calm breath, and spoke with confidence. "The rarest flavor is saffron. It is subtle, delicate, and easy to miss. But when used correctly, it balances the sweetness and richness of the other ingredients perfectly. Most people only notice the dominant flavors, but saffron brings harmony that is often overlooked." The lounge seemed to hold its breath. Sheikh Khalid's eyes lit up with a spark of interest, a faint smile touching his lips. It was clear that he had not expected many to answer correctly, or perhaps he had expected no one at all. Yet here was Amira, standing humbly but confidently, providing not just the correct answer but an explanation that revealed her understanding, observation, and care. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of someone who truly knew her craft. The socialites' smirks vanished. They had expected a humble, nervous waitress, someone who would stumble or falter under the attention of a billionaire. Instead, they were confronted with someone who exuded calm intelligence. Some tried to recover, offering half-hearted guesses, but their uncertainty was obvious. Even the hotel staff looked impressed, nodding subtly to each other as they realized she had answered with precision and depth. Sheikh Khalid stepped closer, his voice carrying warmth mixed with curiosity. "And why do you think most people overlook it?" Amira didn't hesitate. She explained patiently, articulating her observations about flavors, preparation methods, and how attention to detail was often lost in haste or distraction. Her words were measured, thoughtful, and intelligent, reflecting both her knowledge and her dedication. The guests listened in silence, some incredulous that someone they had underestimated could speak with such clarity and confidence. The effect on the room was electric. What had started as a simple test of knowledge had become a revelation. Amira's response transformed her from an overlooked waitress to the center of attention, not because she sought it, but because her skill and character naturally drew it. The arrogance of the mocking guests now seemed petty and small in comparison to her quiet, undeniable competence. Sheikh Khalid nodded slightly, clearly impressed. His gaze, steady and discerning, lingered on her as if he were seeing not just the answer she gave, but the person she was, the hard work, intelligence, and dignity behind every movement she had made that day. For the first time in the evening, he spoke with a tone that was both approving and intriguing. Few notice these things. Most are too focused on appearance or status. But you understand the essence of balance, not just in flavor but in approach. That is rare. Amira felt a mix of pride and humility. She had faced ridicule, judgment, and doubt, and yet her preparation, patience, and knowledge had brought her to this moment. She realized that sometimes the most extraordinary opportunities come when ordinary people remain diligent and true to themselves, even when no one is watching. The socialites and other guests who had previously laughed now looked on in silence. They had assumed superiority, but the Sheikh's question, and Amira's response, had revealed a reality they could not ignore. Respect, they realized, could not be demanded. It could only be earned through skill, intelligence, and character. And in that realization, Amira had quietly become the center of attention, not through arrogance or display, but through competence and authenticity. As the room adjusted to the new dynamic, Sheikh Khalid smiled faintly, a gesture of acknowledgement and interest. Amira continued her work, her confidence steady, aware that this moment had changed something fundamental. It was no longer just a question about a menu. It was a moment that revealed truth, competence, and the power of being seen by someone who truly recognized worth. In that instant, Amira understood that the day she had thought would be ordinary had become extraordinary. She had faced a test of knowledge, composure, and character, and she had passed it brilliantly. And somewhere in the room, Sheikh Khalid was already considering the possibilities that lay ahead, intrigued by the humble waitress who had answered his challenge with grace, intelligence, and quiet authority. The lounge was quieter now, though the air still buzzed with a subtle tension. Every guest, from the haughty socialites to the more reserved businessmen, had turned their attention toward Amira. They had come expecting a show of subservience, a nervous stumble, or an awkward pause. But what they found instead was something entirely different. A calm, intelligent young woman who carried herself with dignity and quiet confidence. Sheikh Khalid watched closely, his gaze steady and assessing. There was something in the way she responded to his question that caught his attention. She hadn't just given an answer. She had explained it with clarity, demonstrating an understanding that went beyond rote knowledge. Her words reflected observation, patience, and a depth of thinking that few people in the room possessed. And for Sheikh Khalid, who had grown accustomed to power and wealth, this type of competence was rare and valuable. The man who had mocked her earlier shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. His friends, who had laughed and whispered behind their hands, now looked unsure, their confidence shaken. They had assumed that someone in her position could never hold her own in a room of sophistication. Yet here she was, standing tall, answering with a precision and intelligence that left them speechless. Even the hotel staff, who had seen many talented servers, whispered among themselves, impressed by her calm authority. Amira understood that this was more than just a question about flavors or ingredients. It was a test of her composure, her ability to think clearly under pressure, and her capacity to communicate effectively. She had learned long ago that knowledge alone was not enough. How one presented it, with confidence and clarity, made all the difference. Taking a deep breath, she expanded on her initial answer, speaking with a steady, measured tone that drew in every listener. "Saffron is delicate and subtle," she began, her voice carrying easily across the quieted lounge. "Many people overlook it because it doesn't announce itself like stronger flavors do. But in a dish, it provides balance. It harmonizes the taste of other ingredients, softening sweetness, enhancing richness, and bringing depth that would otherwise be missing. Most people focus on what is obvious, the bold flavors or flashy ingredients, and miss the quiet ones that hold everything together. Saffron is like that. It works in the background, unnoticed by most, but its effect is essential to the harmony of the dish." As she spoke, Sheikh Khalid nodded slightly, a faint smile appearing at the corners of his mouth. He appreciated not only her knowledge but also the way she articulated it. She wasn't boastful or arrogant. She was simply confident in what she knew, speaking honestly and clearly. That authenticity, rare in a room filled with people who often performed for attention, intrigued him deeply. The socialites at the table shifted uneasily. Their previous laughter had turned into silence, the smug expressions replaced with a mix of surprise and respect. They realized that Amira had turned the moment on its head. What was meant to embarrass her had become a demonstration of intelligence and grace. Their assumptions about her, based purely on her uniform and her position, were proven wrong in the most undeniable way. Encouraged by her composure, Amira continued. She spoke about the subtlety of ingredients, the importance of observation, and how attention to detail often made the difference between a mediocre experience and an exceptional one. Her words were not just about food, they reflected a mindset, a way of thinking that valued patience, understanding, and careful consideration. Every gesture, every word, reinforced the impression that she was someone who understood more than the superficial appearances that others often judged. Sheikh Khalid's interest deepened as he listened. He had encountered many talented individuals in his life, but few who could combine knowledge, calm confidence, and the ability to articulate it so clearly. Amira was not just answering a question. She was demonstrating character. She had remained poised under pressure, turned ridicule into opportunity, and impressed even the most skeptical observers without appearing to try. The man who had mocked her earlier tried to recover, opening his mouth to speak, but no words came. It was as if he realized, belatedly, that he had underestimated her. His friends glanced nervously at each other, their confidence eroding as they recognized the mistake they had made. Meanwhile, the rest of the lounge absorbed the scene in silence, the atmosphere subtly shifting in Amira's favor. Respect, once elusive, was now flowing toward her naturally. Amira sensed the shift. She didn't need to gloat or assert herself. The recognition had come through her actions and her calm clarity. Even the smallest gestures, the way she adjusted a tray, the steady cadence of her words, the thoughtful explanation she gave, contributed to the impression that she was composed, capable, and remarkable in a way that transcended her job title. Sheikh Khalid finally spoke, his voice carrying quiet approval. "Few notice the details others overlook," he said. "Few understand balance the way you do. You see what many cannot, and you communicate it with clarity. That is a rare quality, one that cannot be taught but only discovered through experience and careful observation." Amira's heart beat steadily, though a small spark of pride ignited within her. It was one thing to answer correctly. It was another to be recognized for insight, intelligence, and composure. The moment was not just about winning a question. It was about being seen, truly seen, by someone who mattered. And in that recognition, She felt a quiet validation of all her years of hard work, patience, and perseverance. Around her, the lounge seemed to hold its breath. Guests who had laughed now watched with a mixture of awe and respect. Co-workers whispered among themselves, impressed that someone they had underestimated could command such presence. Even the staff, usually desensitized to displays of skill, exchanged glances of admiration. Amira had turned a moment designed to mock her into one that revealed her true strength and intelligence, and everyone present could see it. As she moved on to serve the next table, Sheikh Khalid's gaze lingered for just a moment longer. He had seen her knowledge, her composure, and her character, and in that instant he recognized someone who could rise above superficial judgments, someone who could thrive under observation and challenge, and someone whose potential had been overlooked by a world too quick to judge by appearance alone. The room had shifted in energy since the moment Amira answered Sheikh Khalid's question. What had begun as a typical evening filled with laughter, chatter, and subtle mockery had transformed into something entirely different. The socialites who had once mocked her now looked awkward, unsure how to reclaim their arrogance in the face of undeniable intelligence and composure. The other guests, many of whom had underestimated her, were now watching with curiosity and admiration. And through it all, Sheikh Khalid's calm, assessing gaze remained fixed on her. Amira continued her work, moving gracefully between tables, serving drinks and arranging appetizers with precision. But now there was a subtle difference in the way she carried herself. She walked taller, her head held higher, not out of pride or arrogance, but out of the quiet confidence that comes from being recognized for one's worth. Every small gesture she made reflected competence, poise, and the assurance that she had finally proven something to those who had doubted her, and perhaps more importantly to herself. Sheikh Khalid approached her once more, this time with a small smile that carried warmth and approval. "You have a rare talent," he said, his voice calm but full of respect. "Not only do you understand balance and detail, but you also communicate it with clarity and confidence. That is a quality that cannot be taught. It must be earned." Amira felt a rush of emotion. Years of hard work, quiet perseverance, and patience had led to this very moment. She had endured ridicule, doubt, and judgment from those who assumed her position defined her abilities. But now, in the eyes of a man whose opinion carried weight beyond imagination, she was seen for who she truly was, skilled, intelligent, and capable. The Sheikh's words were followed by an unexpected gesture. He extended his hand and said, "I would like to offer you an opportunity. If you are willing, there is a place where your skills, your insight, and your character will be valued, and where you can grow beyond what most people imagine possible." A hush fell over the lounge. The socialites blinked in disbelief, their jaws slack, while other guests murmured in surprise. No one had expected such recognition, let alone an offer from someone so influential. Amira's co-workers looked at her with wide eyes, some filled with admiration, others tinged with jealousy. For Amira herself, the moment was almost surreal. She had come into this luxurious world expecting to be overlooked, maybe even ridiculed, and now she was being offered a chance to step into a realm she had only dreamed about. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and nodded politely. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice calm but filled with quiet gratitude. "I would be honored to learn and contribute." The Sheikh smiled, clearly pleased with her response. "Good. I have a feeling this will be the beginning of something remarkable," he said. As he moved away to continue his rounds, the lounge seemed to exhale collectively. The tension that had lingered since his arrival dissipated, replaced with awe and admiration. Amira's transformation in the eyes of the room was complete. She was no longer just a humble waitress. She had become a symbol of intelligence, poise, and the power of quiet strength. The socialites who had mocked her earlier were now subdued. Some tried to regain their composure, offering forced smiles or polite nods, but the moment had passed them by. They had been reminded that respect could not be demanded, it must be earned. And in this case, Amira had earned it effortlessly, through knowledge, confidence, and the way she carried herself under scrutiny. Her co-workers began to approach her quietly, offering congratulations or words of encouragement. Even those who had whispered jokes earlier seemed to acknowledge her skill and composure with newfound respect. Amira smiled politely, accepting the recognition with humility. She understood that this was not a moment to boast, but a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought her here and the possibilities that lay ahead. Amira's mind raced with possibilities. The opportunity Sheikh Khalid had offered could change her life in ways she had never imagined. She could learn from someone extraordinary, gain experiences that would broaden her skills, and perhaps find a place where her abilities were not just noticed, but truly valued. Yet, she also understood that this transformation was more than just an opportunity. It was validation of the qualities she had always held close: diligence, intelligence, patience, and courage. She thought about her years working in the cafe, the long hours, the low pay, and the moments of quiet frustration when customers judged her unfairly. She remembered the mockery, the doubts, and the times she had questioned whether her efforts would ever matter. And now, all of that experience had led to this moment. An affirmation that staying true to oneself, working diligently, and remaining patient could open doors that once seemed impossible. The Sheikh returned briefly to speak with her again, offering guidance and advice. Observe everything, learn as much as you can, and never underestimate the power of careful attention, he said. Those who notice the details and understand the balance in life often achieve what others cannot. Amira nodded, absorbing every word. She realized that this was more than just a chance to work in a luxurious environment or gain recognition. It was an opportunity to grow, to challenge herself, and to demonstrate her capabilities on a larger stage. She understood that true transformation came not from wealth or status, but from being recognized for one's character, knowledge, and dedication. As the evening continued, Amira noticed the subtle changes in the people around her. Guests now approached her with polite questions, some seeking advice or insight, while others offered genuine compliments. The socialites who had mocked her were quieter, more measured, perhaps reflecting on their earlier assumptions. Even her co-workers seemed inspired, realizing that true skill and character could shine in the most unlikely places. For Amira, the transformation was both external and internal. She felt a renewed sense of confidence, a recognition of her own worth, and an understanding that her abilities could open doors she had only dreamed of. The mockery and judgment that had once weighed heavily on her seemed distant now, replaced by a sense of possibility and hope. She had faced doubt and ridicule and emerged not only unbroken but stronger, recognized, and ready for the next step in her journey. By the end of the evening, it was clear to everyone present that Amira was no longer just the humble waitress who had walked into the lavish lounge hours earlier. She had become someone remarkable, someone whose knowledge, composure, and courage had earned her recognition from one of the most powerful men in the room. And as she prepared to step into the opportunities awaiting her, she carried with her the quiet confidence that comes from having proven, first to herself and then to the world, that true strength and value are measured not by appearances, but by character, intelligence, and perseverance. The evening was winding down, the soft music now a gentle hum, and the last of the guests drifting toward the exit. The grandeur of the hotel, with its sparkling chandeliers and polished marble floors, seemed even more pronounced now, though for Amira, the place no longer felt intimidating. Instead, it had become a stage on which she had proven her worth, intelligence, and composure to everyone present, including the most influential man in the room. She moved carefully between tables, collecting empty glasses and tidying up the plates, her hands steady and her mind clear. Yet beneath her calm exterior, a quiet excitement pulsed through her. This night had been more than a shift at a luxurious venue. It had been a turning point. She remembered the mocking laughter of the socialites, the whispers of doubt, and the subtle sneers from those who had assumed they knew her limits. And now all of that had been transformed. Not through confrontation or anger, but through her knowledge, patience, and quiet confidence. Sheikh Khalid had already left the lounge, but his presence lingered like a subtle energy in the room. The way he had observed, assessed, and acknowledged her had left an indelible impression. He hadn't just asked a question. He had seen her, the depth of her knowledge, the strength of her character, and the grace with which she carried herself. That recognition, simple yet profound, was more powerful than anything she had ever experienced. Amira paused for a moment near the large windows, gazing out at the city lights twinkling like distant stars. Her thoughts wandered back over the years, the early mornings at the cafe, the long hours, the small victories, and the constant challenges. She remembered the people who had laughed at her, dismissed her, or assumed that she was incapable of more than a simple service job. And she realized something. Those moments had prepared her for this night. Every small act of diligence, every lesson learned in patience and observation, every time she had chosen composure over bitterness, they had all led her here. The transformation she felt was not just about external recognition. It was internal. She felt a sense of empowerment, the kind that comes from proving to oneself that limitations imposed by others do not define who you are. Her life, once confined by modest means and cautious expectations, now seemed filled with possibility. The experience at the hotel had shown her that her skills, intelligence, and character were valuable, and that there were opportunities for someone willing to remain diligent, observant, and true to themselves. Even the hotel staff, who had watched her throughout the evening, began to approach her with respect and curiosity. A few of her co-workers whispered quietly, acknowledging the way she had handled the Sheikh's challenge and the earlier mockery. Their admiration was a reflection of something deeper. They had witnessed a triumph that went beyond mere skill. It was the triumph of composure, intelligence, and courage under pressure. Amira smiled politely, accepting their recognition without pride, knowing that true strength was quiet, not loud or boastful. As she continued her work, she couldn't help but reflect on the unexpected nature of life's opportunities. The shift had begun like any other, routine and ordinary, yet it had led to a moment of extraordinary change. The recognition from Sheikh Khalid had opened a door that she had never imagined approaching. It wasn't just about working in a luxurious environment or gaining prestige. It was about being seen, truly seen, for what she was capable of. And that recognition, she understood, was worth far more than wealth or status alone. Her thoughts returned briefly to the socialites who had mocked her. They had assumed that appearance, wealth, or status could determine who was respected. But the night had revealed a different truth. True respect is earned through knowledge, composure, and character. Those who had once laughed at her now understood, whether consciously or not, that they had underestimated someone they should never have doubted. And in that quiet reversal, Amira found a sense of justice, not vengeance, but validation. Amira also thought about the Sheikh's words earlier, the way he had acknowledged her attention to detail, her understanding of balance, and her ability to articulate it. Those words lingered in her mind, not just as praise, but as guidance for the future. She realized that this was not the end of her journey, but the beginning. There were lessons to learn, opportunities to seize, and skills to develop that could carry her to heights she had only dreamed about. The recognition tonight was a stepping stone, a validation that she was capable of more than she had ever allowed herself to imagine. As the last guests left and the lounge staff began to tidy up for the night, Amira took a moment to breathe deeply. The chandeliers above reflected light across the polished floors, a sparkling reminder of the extraordinary evening she had just experienced. She felt a quiet pride, not boastful, but grounded in the realization that her diligence, intelligence, and grace had transformed a moment of mockery into one of recognition and possibility. Amira walked toward the exit, her steps steady and purposeful. She felt lighter, freer, as if a weight she hadn't realized she had been carrying had been lifted. The challenges, the doubts, and the judgments of others no longer seemed insurmountable. She understood that life could present opportunities when least expected, but only those prepared, patient, and observant would recognize and seize them. And tonight she had done exactly that. Stepping out into the cool night air, she glanced at the city skyline. Her heart was full of hope and quiet determination. The journey ahead was unknown, but for the first time, she felt fully ready to face it. She had been tested, mocked, and observed, and she had triumphed, not through luck or fortune, but through knowledge, composure, and the courage to be herself. Amira smiled to herself, a small, private smile of satisfaction. The world had underestimated her, but she had proven that strength, intelligence, and grace were far more powerful than appearances. And as she walked toward whatever awaited her next, she carried with her a renewed sense of purpose, ready to embrace the opportunities, challenges, and triumphs that life had in store. In that quiet reflection, she understood the essence of her journey. True recognition is earned, not given. True transformation comes from within, and triumph is not about wealth, status, or applause, but about remaining steadfast, composed, and true to oneself, even when the world doubts you. Tonight, Amira had learned all of this, and her life would never be the same again.